All right. Today we're going to be reading chapter 2 of this book, Who is Jesus? It is written by Gilbert, chapter 2, An Extraordinary Man and Then Some. It was 10 minutes until 8 o'clock on a Friday morning when an ordinary-looking man rode up the escalator in a busy Washington, D.C. subway station, positioned himself against a wall, and opened his violin case. He pulled out his instrument, its age showing, the finish on its back worn down in some places, all the way to the bare wood, and he turned the case around to receive any donations a passerby might want to give. Then he began to play. For the next 45 minutes, as the man played a selection of classical music, over 1,000 busy Washingtonians hurried by. One or two cocked their heads, clearly enjoying the sound, but no crowd ever formed around him. One fellow realized he was running 3 minutes early for work, so he leaned up against a column and listened for exactly 3 minutes. Mostly, though, people simply went about their business, reading their papers, listening to their iPods, hurrying away to whatever appointment was showing up next on their screens. Oh, the music was good. It filled up the arcade, dancing and flowing with incredible precision, and left a few people thinking later that at least for the split second they'd paid attention, it really did sound like something special. The musician himself didn't look like much. Black long-sleeve t-shirt, black pants, Washington Nationals baseball cap. But ever so, if you stopped to listen, you couldn't help noticing that this was something more than just another musician playing the violin for pocket change. As a musician, this guy was pretty amazing. One man even commented later that most people, they play music, they don't feel it. Well, that man was feeling it. That man was moving into the sound. If you just listened, he said, you could tell in 1 second that this guy was good. Well, of course you could, because it wasn't just any musician playing the violin that Friday morning in the subway station. It wasn't even a musician who was merely extraordinary. It was Joshua Bell, a 39-year-old internationally acclaimed virtuoso who normally plays in the most celebrated venues in the world, to crowds who respect him so much that they even stifle their coughs until intermission. Not only that, but that morning, Bell was playing some of the most exquisite Baroque music ever written. He was doing it on a 300-year-old Stradivarius violin worth an estimated $3.5 million. The whole scene was calculated to be beautiful. The most beautiful music ever written, played on one of the most finely calibrated instruments ever crafted by one of the most talented musicians alive. And yes, for all that, you still had to stop and pay attention to see just how beautiful it really was. So much of life is like that, isn't it? In all the hustle and bustle of work, family, friends, bills, and fun, things like beauty and grandeur sometimes get squeezed out of our minds. We don't have time to appreciate them because doing so would require us to stop and pay attention to something besides the urgent. The same thing is true when it comes to Jesus. Most of us, if we're familiar with him at all, really know him only on the surface. Maybe we know a few of the most famous stories about him, or we can quote some of his more famous sayings. Without a doubt, in his day, there was something about Jesus that caught people's attention. But if you're really going to know Jesus, understand him, and grasp his real significance, you have to look a little harder. You have to get beyond the usual debates, the common sound bites, and the familiar stories to see what lies ahead beyond the surface. Because, like the violinist in the subway, it would be a tragic mistake to dismiss Jesus as merely an extraordinary man. So let's be honest, even if you're not a religious kind of person, even if you don't immediately buy into the idea that Jesus was the Son of God or the Savior of the world, you have to admit that he was pretty attention-grabbing. Over and over, he did things that caught the eye of his contemporaries, said things that left them amazed at his wisdom, and even confronted them in ways that left fumbling around for a way to make sense of it all. At first glance, it would have been easy to mistake Jesus for just one more of the hundreds of religious teachers that debuted rose, fell, and disappeared in and around first century Jerusalem. Religious teaching in those days wasn't what it was today. Yes, people listened in order to gain insight, to understand the scriptures better, and to learn how to live more righteously. But believe it or not, they also listened to religious teaching for sheer entertainment value. After all, if you don't have movies, television, and smartphones, what in the world do you do for fun? You pack a picnic and go listen to a preacher. Strange as that might sound to us, it also helps us understand how unusually good teacher Jesus was as a teacher. Because the first people of first century Israel heard so many teachers, and so often they had opinions about them that were as finely tuned as ours about movie actors. To put it mildly, they weren't easily impressed. So it's worth stopping to notice what's really going on when the Bible says over and over again that people were astonished by Jesus' teachings. That incredible statement shows up in the gospel, the Bible's 4 accounts of Jesus' life, no fewer than 10 times. Here's one example recorded by Matthew after Jesus taught on the side of the mountain. When Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teachings, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, not as their scribes. Don't miss the dig here. The people were saying that the scribes, the ones whose job it was to teach with authority, couldn't hold a candle to Jesus and his teaching. And it was like that everywhere he went and every time he taught. Sometimes the emotion was described in different words. Look at the reaction the very first time he preached in his hometown. All spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words that were coming from his mouth. And this is how it was in a little fishing village called Capernaum. They were astonished at his teaching, for he taught as one who had authority. Back in his hometown again, many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what was this wisdom given to him?" And then at the big show in Jerusalem at the temple, the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they feared him because all the crowds were astonished at his teaching. Over and over again, the reaction to Jesus was a kind of bewildered, head-shaking incredulity. In a culture that saw teaching as one of its primary forms of public entertainment, Jesus got extraordinary reviews. But why? What was so unusual and attention-grabbing about Jesus' teaching? Part of it was that once people began to challenge him and ask him questions, Jesus proved to be a masterful chess player. He simply refused to get caught up in verbal or intellectual traps, and in fact always managed to turn the heat back on the one who posed the challenge in the first place. And even then, he did it in a way that would not only win in the argument, but also spiritually challenge everyone who was listening. Let me show you an example. Matthew 22 recounts a time when Jesus was teaching in the temple in Jerusalem, and a group of Jewish leaders approached him in order to challenge him. Now, this wasn't an accidental meeting. These leaders had planned the whole thing. The story even starts by saying that the Pharisees plotted how to entangle him in his words. They also wanted to do it publicly, so they walked up while Jesus was teaching in the temple, probably pushed through a crowd, and interrupted him. They started with flattery. "Teacher," they crooned, "we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances." You can see what they're doing here. They're trying to force Jesus to answer by implying that if he doesn't, he's a charlatan and a quack. So the stage set, they ask him a question. "Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, that question might have taken some time and planning to develop because it is exquisite in its precision. It's meant to skewer Jesus in one way or the other and his influence, and perhaps even get him arrested. Here's how. In those days, the prevailing opinion among the Pharisees, and they taught this to the people too, was that it was actually sinful to give any honor at all, including taxes, to a foreign government. To do so, they thought, was inherently to dishonor God himself. So think about it. How did the Pharisees want Jesus to answer that question? By publicly agreeing with them that paying the taxes was unlawful and inherently dishonoring to God or not. The truth is they didn't care how he answered. Either way, they thought they had him. On the one hand, if Jesus said, yes, it is lawful to pay taxes, the crowd would be furious and Jesus' influence would be shattered. But on the other hand, if he said, no, don't pay these taxes, then he was at risk. He was risking the wrath of the Romans for publicly inciting sedition, and he'd probably be arrested, in which case his influence would also be over. Either way, that's what the Pharisees wanted. The end of Jesus as a cultural force. But Jesus eluded the trap, turned the whole question on its head, and left them all again astonished. Show me the coin for the tax, he said. So they handed him one. Jesus looked at it and held it up to the crowd. Whose likeness and inscription is this, he asked. It was an easy question. Caesar's, they answered. And they were correct. Right there on the coin was the face and name of Emperor Tiberius Caesar. That's whose coin it was. It belonged to him. It had his face on it. It was made in his mint, and the Jewish people obviously were happy to use those coins for their own benefit. Given all that, why shouldn't they give back to Caesar what was so obviously his? So Jesus answered to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Now that seems like a pretty straightforward answer, doesn't it? It's Caesar's coin, pay the tax. And yet the Bible says that when people heard it, they marveled. Why? Well, for one thing, Jesus had just redefined the way the Jewish people should think about their relationship to the Romans, and he had undercut the teaching of the Pharisees at the same time. However you slice it, it simply was not dishonoring to God in any way to give Caesar what was rightfully and obviously his. But there was another level of depth to what Jesus said too, and that's what left people slack-jawed in amazement. Think back to the question Jesus asked when he showed the crowd the coin, whose image is on this, he said. And when they answered it was Caesar's, Jesus took that as proof of ownership. It was Caesar's image on the coin, and therefore he owned it, and therefore you should give it to Caesar what is Caesar's. But, and here's the kicker, you should also render to God what is God's. That is, you should give to God that which has his image on it. And what exactly is that? Everyone in the crowd, of course, knew immediately. Jesus was talking about Genesis 1:26, where God announced his plans to create humankind by saying, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. You see, Jesus was speaking to the people about something much more profound than political philosophy. He was saying that just as Caesar's image is on the coin, so God's image is reflected in the very core of your being, and therefore you belong to him. Yes, there's a certain honor that's rendered to Caesar when you acknowledge his image and give his coin back to him. But the infinitely greater honor is rendered when you recognize God's image in yourself and give yourself, your heart, soul, mind, and strength to him. I hope you can see what Jesus was telling his audience. Far more important than any discussion about political philosophy or one nation's relationship to one another is the question of every human being relationship to God. Jesus was teaching that all of us are made by God, and indeed you are made by God. You are created in his image and his likeness, and therefore you belong to him and are accountable to him. And therefore, Jesus said, you should render unto God what is rightfully God's, nothing less than your whole self. It's no wonder that people were amazed at Jesus' teaching. In just a few sentences, he had managed to pull the rug from under his challengers, redefine the prevailing political theology of his day, and at the same time drill down to the most fundamental fact of human existence. That kind of teaching would have been enough to draw a crowd by itself. But then there were the miracles too. Hundreds and hundreds of people saw with their own eyes Jesus do things that no human being should be able to do. He healed people of sickness. He made water into wine. He told lame people to walk again, and they did. He brought sanity to people who were given over as hopelessly insane. He even made people who were dead come back to life. It's not that people in those days were just inexcusably gullible about such things. Yes, they lived a long time ago, but that doesn't mean they were primitive or stupid. They didn't walk around claiming to see miracles every day. In fact, That's why every time you read another paragraph of the Bible, you see someone else standing wide-eyed in astonishment at what just happened. These people were surprised to see Jesus doing these things. Even more to the point, precisely because so many people were trying to make a name for themselves as religious gurus, the first century Jews had gotten incredibly good at identifying charlatans and fakes. They were masters at seeing through magicians' illusions and shaking their heads in laughter as they walked away from yet another guy trying to pass off one more parlor trick as a miracle. The last thing you would call these people was gullible. But Jesus left them amazed. Unlike all the others, this man really was extraordinary. The other guys pulled rabbits out of hats. This man healed people by the hundreds, even until he was physically worn out and had to sleep. He took 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread and made a meal for 5,000 people, who quickly became 5,000 eyewitnesses to the event. He stopped beside a man who had been lame for years and told him to get up and walk, and the man did. He stood on the prow of a boat and told the ocean to be quiet, and it did. He stood in front of the tomb of a man who had been dead for 4 days and called to him to come back to life, and the man heard him, stood up, and walked out of the tomb. Nobody did things like that, ever, and the people were amazed. But even then, there was more. If you really paid attention, if you got beyond the wonder of it all and began to ask the deeper question of why was Jesus doing all this, you could begin to see that it was all for a purpose. You see, with every one of his miracles and in every one of his sermons, Jesus was making and backing up claims about himself that no human being could ever make. Take, for example, Jesus' most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. At first glance, it almost looks like a run-of-the-mill moralistic, live like this, not like that harangue. Don't make oaths, don't commit adultery, don't lust, don't get angry, but look again. And you'll realize how to behave is not its main point. Actually, the Sermon on the Mount is primarily about Jesus making an audacious claim that he has the right to interpret Old Testament law, to say what it means and why it's there in the first place. That's why Jesus says over and over again in that sermon, "You have heard it was said, but I say to you." The emphasis is on I. Jesus is making a radical claim that he is the nation of Israel's rightful legislator. What's more, to look at where he's making this claim. He's doing it very deliberately on top of a mountain, and as every Israelite would have remembered, the great lawgiver, that's God, gave his people the Old Testament law by speaking to them from the top of a mountain. You see, Jesus was claiming for himself a breathtaking authority that no one else would ever have dreamed to claim. Then there was what he said at the tomb of a dead man to Martha, the dead man's sister, "Your brother will rise again." Martha appreciated the reminder. "I know," she answered. "He will rise again in the resurrection on the last days." In other words, yes, I know. Thank you for your kind sentiment. That they're very comforting to me in this difficult season, but she didn't understand what Jesus meant. It would have been astonishing enough to see Jesus if Jesus had said to her then, "No, I mean, he will rise again in a few minutes when I tell him to." But he even said more than that. He said, "I am the resurrection. I am the life." Don't walk by and miss that. It wasn't just I can give life. It was I am life. Really, what kind of man says things like that? What kind of man hears his friends say to him in awe, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and answers him with essentially exactly, "And it's God himself who told you that"? What kind of man is asked by the rulers of his nation, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" and answers them back, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven"? No ordinary man, that's for sure. No one who just wants to be recognized as a great teacher or honored as a good person or remembered as an influential philosopher. No, a person who talks about himself in those terms is claiming something far larger and more glorious and more world-shatteringly profound than any of that. And that's exactly what Jesus was doing, at least for those who were paying attention. He was claiming to be Israel's and humanity's king.